Hello and welcome to Sales 101 for the Genetic Counselor. My name is Sarah Witherington and I will be presenting today along with my co-presenter Emily Dalton. I wanted to give a little bit of background about myself so that way you know who is presenting to you today. So like I said, my name is Sarah Witherington. I am a genetic counselor and I currently work as a product manager for Quest Diagnostics. I have a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Louisiana State University and a master's in genetic counseling from Northwestern. I graduated in 2013. Originally, when I first came out of school, I took a job with Ambry Genetics, working as a field-based genetic liaison. I moved around within Ambry, still doing field-based genetic counseling work in the sales division, and then I came over to Quest and also worked as a field-based genetic counselor for several years before now working in the product management role and in Quest and Athena. So I've had several different roles within sales and now even working in more of the product management side. So Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Emily Dalton. I'm also a genetic counselor. I got my bachelor's degree in cell and molecular biology from Skidmore College and then went on to Boston University for my master's degree, where I graduated in 2009. So I actually started in the clinic. I worked as a cancer genetic counselor at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute for about 4.5 years. And then, similar to Sarah, got my start in industry at Ambry Genetics as a field-based genetic specialist, so working mostly with our oncology products. From there, I moved up to become a manager of genetic specialists, managing a team of 7 other genetic counselors and other professionals in the field. And my current role within Ambry is actually the director of the entire genetic specialist team. So leading both oncology and all of our other products, those field-based genetic counseling positions. So I'd like to go through the objectives for our training today. So Sarah and I thought that we would start with a background because there are some sales terms and sales methods that genetic counselors aren't necessarily familiar with. I know I certainly wasn't when I started in this field and was actually surprised that sales is a science and there's a lot of different methods around it. So we thought that would be important information to share. And we'll also go through some information related to what these positions typically look like and some expectations for that. Then we really wanted to take the application or take the background and apply it to kind of real life. So how you actually apply some of these sales tactics in a position like this, and also how to work with your sales team, with your clients, etc. In these field-based positions. And then lastly, we want to spend some time going through how your genetic counseling skills can really be used within a sales-based position. There's actually a lot of overlap between what you learn in genetic counseling school and these translatable skills that you can use in a sales-based position. So we want to highlight some of those and provide some examples as well. So I'll turn it back over to Sarah to start our background, and then you'll hear from me a little bit later.
Thanks, Emily. So one of the things I think that genetic counselors may struggle with whenever they're first looking at a sales role is some of the common terms that we use in day-to-day role as a sales-based genetic counselor that aren't common or terms that we normally would hear in a genetic counseling role. I think one of the first ones, and funnily enough, they all seem to have a lot of acronyms that make it difficult. But as a customer relationship management or a CRM, one of the most common examples of this is Salesforce.com. And really the way to think about this is a database of all of the clients that you may visit with and your sales team may visit with. And it's a great repository and wealth of knowledge where you and your sales colleagues will enter in information about the clients that you visit, who you're meeting with, what their issues are, things like that. Another common term is prospect. So a prospect you might think of some sort of gold mining type of thing, but really it's a potential future client. So somebody that you think might be interested in your services. Whereas a lead is really someone that there's a high potential of it being a future client. So somebody that has come and visited your booth while you're at a trade show, and they really want somebody to come and visit them. Another common term is a funnel or a pipeline. I also hear it called the 30, 60, 90-day plan, where it's a sales process that gets you moving through each one of your different opportunities that you might have in your quote-unquote pipeline. So do you think you would close it in 30 days? Do you think you would close it in 90 days, 60 days, and so on? So it helps the sales force forecast where they may be and what amount of testing they may get through the door. And since I used the word forecast, one of the words forecasting, so looking at how far along that you feel like you can get a likelihood of success in that quarter, so looking ahead to the future. And talking about closes are really whenever you finally get that final commitment from a customer to try your product. And these two terms, hunter and farmer, really go together. So a hunter would be somebody that helps develop new business. They go out, you might hear them called like a business development type of person, or a farmer. A farmer might be considered like an account manager, an individual that maintains the current business that they have. So now that we've gotten through some of those common terms, one of the other things we want to talk about is the sales process versus the methodology. And I think, Emily, you had mentioned to me that one of the surprising things about sales is that really people go to school just to study sales, and that this is a skill that you have to hone in the same way that you have to hone your skills as a genetic counselor. There's special terminology. There's many different types of sales methodologies that you can use. So each company may pick a different sales methodology that they want to use, and then there's a specific sales process. So a sales rep may go through a specific sales process in order to close a new customer, versus the sales methodology would be an overarching theme that the salesperson uses or the company chooses to use. This will make a little bit more sense on the next slide. So a sales process would be going from prospecting, so looking for those clients, connecting with those clients, so having those first early stages to get the information, researching more about your client, presenting to them what your solution is, and then eventually closing. When you look at this, you might say this doesn't seem very similar to genetic counseling, but if you change the words, you can see that it can be very similar to a genetic counseling process. So connecting initially would be first meeting your patient in your clinic. Researching them might be asking them questions to develop a mutual agenda to get you through the session. Whereas presenting would be you as the genetic counselor presenting the different testing options to the patient. And then the close would really be coming to that mutual agreed upon decision or an informed decision process that would get them to choose either whether or not they want testing or whether or not they would rather not have testing. As far as sales methodology, I think a lot of people might have the idea of that sleazy salesperson, but really overall in the sales world, everybody is moving away from that and really focusing more on either question-based selling, which is one of the most common types, consultative selling, or solution-based selling. And there are several books about each one of these different kinds of sales tactics. So if you talk a little bit about each one, so solution selling is really what it seems. You're looking to find where the customer's pain points are and to present them with solutions on what it would achieve for that customer. In consultative selling, you really become a trusted advisor. So you work with that client long term. You really end up being a consultant or an advisor to them over time, and they trust you and you trust them, and that leads to long-term sales. Question-based selling, which I think has a lot of similarities to a genetic counseling, the genetic counseling field, is you as the salesperson or genetics professional doesn't do a lot of the talking. Really, you're asking questions of the person in front of you to decide, to hear what their needs are, learning more about them to come to a decision process. So when we talk about question-based selling, and this is the first sales methodology that I learned. I've learned more since then and have read many other types of methodologies, but this is the first one that I learned, and I think it is one of the most common. So really you ask your customer questions about what types of patients do they see, you know, for if you were a genetic counselor in clinic, you instead would ask the patient, how do they feel about genetic testing potentially? So asking your client or your customer different questions about their situation, what problems do they see? And then you flip it around and you say, so how would offering this testing affect your patient, or how would you feel as a patient if we offered you this testing? And then long-term, coming to a consensus about whether or not something is a right fit for them. And so whenever you put it in this context, I think it becomes a little bit more clear that there are a lot of similarities between a sales-based process and the genetic counseling process that we learn in school. So now I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So we thought this would be a little bit fun to share. So talking about the different sales personalities, and really what we want to highlight is we know that there is kind of a stereotype, a positive stereotype about genetic counselors, that we're all very type A, very organized, kind of a certain type of person. But really when you get down to it, you know, we are still all individuals and we have our different styles. Just in terms of how we treat our patients, how we treat our clients, et cetera. And that certainly translates to sales reps as well. A lot of you have probably had some interaction with sales reps and can kind of see the different personalities. But this is also important because these are the folks that you'll likely be working with in a position like this. So we have the hard worker, those that really show up early, stay late. They're always kind of willing to put in the extra effort. They don't give up, they're self-motivated. Then there's the challenger. So these are really the debaters. They have a really deep understanding of the business, and they use that to really push the customer's thinking and teach them something new about how their product is superior and how they can kind of help them compete more effectively. And then you have the relationship builder, and those are the ones that, you know, they're really kind of the first step is just building that trust, building that relationship, being an advocate for their customer, for their client, and just really kind of going above and beyond for them. The lone wolf, we've all worked with those before, I think. They're those deeply self-confident. They kind of follow their own instincts instead of the rules. Usually they have results, but not always. But these can certainly be a challenge working in a partnership with you know, a genetic counselor as well. And then there's the reactive problem solver. So this is someone who's highly reliable, very detail oriented, and they focus on ensuring that all of the promises that are made as part of a sale are upheld. Let's see. We're just trying, there we go. Okay. So now we'll get into what does a GC sales role typically look like? And we want to be clear here that what we're talking about in the next couple of slides is that genetic specialist, MSL type role, where you're really a partner to the sales rep. We certainly have genetic counselors who go on to become traditional sales reps, so they are in that role. But really what we're referencing here is the partner to that person in the field. So not the traditional sales rep, but really the kind of clinical and technical expert that partners with the sales rep, just as a quick clarification. So typically, genetic specialist or MSL is working with at least one, but usually multiple reps. And that's because, the reps have smaller territories, they're trying to grow the business, find new business, whereas the GC is really most often brought in for higher level appointments and to really pull through the business. And our primary role is to provide clinical and technical support for the customers. So we really want to be that expert for them, really know the products inside and out. Most of these roles, this is a really important one, have about 50% travel. And that varies. It's not going to be as if you're gone one week, home another week. There might be a month where you don't travel, and then another month where you're gone every week. And so it really depends on what your role is, what your territory is, what your geography is. Certainly, some parts of the country are more concentrated, and so you may have more day trips, but less overnight. Whereas if you have a really large geographic territory, you can expect to be gone overnight more often. Sometimes there is opportunity for commission or bonus, but that is very company dependent. So it's something you should certainly ask if you're interviewing for one of these jobs, but it's not always a given. Another important aspect is that there's typically limited to no patient contact with these roles. Part of that comes from this kind of perceived conflict of interest, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But really, you should think of it that instead of the patient being your client, the medical professional becomes your client. So if they have questions about how to interpret a report or what testing is the most appropriate, they'll call you, and then you can kind of help them translate that information for their patients. So to kind of be that bridge between the medical professional and their patients. Typically, it's a pretty flexible schedule, but that also means that it's not always a 9 to 5. So working from home does have its benefits, but oftentimes in these sales roles, there can be overtime and weekends. We do a lot of dinners, speaking at dinner presentations. We work at a lot of trade shows. I'm sure you've seen your friendly genetic counselors working the booth at NSGC for their respective companies. Oftentimes, because we're based in the field, we don't get to see our colleagues all that often, and so we have regular sales meetings, whether they're quarterly or twice a year, where we all get together, and those tend to be really, really long days and nights to kind of jam pack everything we need to do together in one fell swoop. So, there is definitely some flexibility, not having to go into an office every day, but at the same time, it certainly can even out, and there can be some long hours as well. The other thing about working from home is that it can also be hard to get away from your job. So you're not leaving an office, leaving your computer and shutting it off at the end of the day. Your phone is always with you. Your computer is just a step away. So you really have to have strong time management skills and also kind of be able to self-direct that division between home and work. Typically, you coordinate your own travel, so it is important to have strong organization skills and kind of just be savvy about that. A lot of companies will use a certain travel agency or certain airlines or something like that that will be made known to you when you join a company. But typically, you're the one that's coordinating your own travel. And I'll just add a little extra thing here too that I learned as part of being a GC in a sales role. I was pretty clueless before this to, things like points and perks and kind of joining all the rewards programs. And that's definitely an added benefit to having a role where you travel, is kind of taking advantage of all those miles and taking advantage of hotel programs and things like that. Most of the time you're able to do that with a company. So that's definitely something that if you start out, when you start your traveling based position, you can definitely build up some miles and some points that you can use for personal use. So that's another little tip I'll share.
And I think TSA pre-check is an absolute must on this point.
Absolutely. Good point, Sarah. Yes. 100% yes. It's well worth the money, and oftentimes companies will actually reimburse you for that too if you travel enough. So all those little perks and little tricks to kind of save time and make traveling easier will make your quality of life a lot better. Typically with these GC sales roles, we do try to be smart about our travel and visit lots of clients per travel visit. And part of that is just being a good steward of company money. You don't want to spend $1,000 on a flight and a hotel to go have one meeting somewhere. You really want to make good use of your time, and also for yourself as well. You know, if you're traveling somewhere, you want it to be worthwhile and to make sure you're getting a lot of bang for your buck and seeing a lot of clients. That may not always be possible 100% of the time. You know, if you're going somewhere in the middle of nowhere where there really isn't anyone else around, or if it's just a really, really big meeting and you really have to work around that client's schedule. There may be some one-offs, but for the most part, we try to, you know, pack our trips in with multiple meetings a day so that they're worthwhile. Another important point that you may not consider going into this role, but that will very quickly become apparent, is that as you're meeting with different clients, it's really important to establish yourself as the clinical and technical professional versus a straight salesperson. So, you know, you don't look any different than the salesperson going in there. So, you know, a physician or someone may not know to differentiate the two of you. So that's a really important point when you're starting out a meeting with a new client or making introductions and you're there with your rep, that you clearly delineate those roles. And most clients will be really happy that they have, you know, a direct clinical or technical person that they can utilize as a resource. And so they'll be happy to know that you have that specific role, but it is important to establish that from the get-go so that those roles are very clear. Also, as I mentioned before, you do need strong time management skills for a position like this. You know, it can be difficult if you're in the field all day to then come back to an inbox full of emails and have to respond to those. Obviously, being in meetings. Another big aspect of this job are internal conference calls. So again, because we're not face-to-face with our colleagues every day, we do have a lot of conference calls to stay in touch, stay in the know. And, you know, they are very important, even though they can sometimes go long or be back to back. But it is a really important way to kind of stay connected with your colleagues. And that's another thing you'll have to balance. And then just the, you know, the necessities like food, travel, and sleep. So kind of knowing what your go-to snack is in the airport if you have a tight connection, you know, and just kind of leaving yourself enough time for layovers and not having to rush, not be stressed, but also kind of getting where you need to be as quickly as possible. So that definitely comes with some practice, but if you kind of have that innate ability to manage your time well and be efficient, that'll certainly serve you well in a position like this. So we also wanted to talk about beyond sales, because I think so often when people think about a genetic specialist role or a field-based kind of sales genetic counseling role, they only think about that client interaction and those client meetings where you're in, you know, face-to-face doing presentations, etc. But there's really a lot of other opportunity for positions like this to kind of get your feet wet with some other tasks within the company. So a big one is research and publications. I've been involved, I think 4 or 5 peer-reviewed publications, and I don't even know how many posters since I've been at Ambry. And so that's been really rewarding for me. That was something that I had a big interest in when I was joining Ambry. And, you know, there's obviously working at a commercial lab, you have access to so much valuable data, more than you'd ever have at, you know, a single clinic. And the other aspect of this is that you're in a really good position to form research collaboration. So you're the front line, you know, you're the customer facing individual. And so if clients have an interesting case, or if they have an interesting question that they want answered and they want to use your company's data, you can be in a really good position to be a liaison between, you know, your clinical research department and your clients to kind of get those collaborations off the ground. And it can be really rewarding to see to see a project really from start to finish. So from that first initial conversation with a clinician about, hey, I'm really interested in this, and then kind of seeing it through the process all the way through a publication. And then, of course, all companies like to have a lot of visibility at the big trade shows that we attend, and research is a great way to do this. So the more posters and publications and things that we can talk about at the booth to promote ourselves are, just going to make us look better. And so these field-based genetic counseling positions are in a really good a good spot to do those. Of course, formal presentations, and that kind of translates back to some important skills for a role like this, where you have to be really comfortable with public speaking, really comfortable in front of people, because that's going to be a big part of what you do if it's just, a dinner with one practice or a big grand rounds, or, a formal presentation at a big trade show. So I've actually had the opportunity to present all over the world with Ambry, and, it's something where, you just, even if you're presenting to people where English isn't their first language, you want to make it translatable, you want to be animated, you want to make it interesting, and so that's a big part of it. Another thing that genetic counselors in this role work on a lot is the marketing collateral development. So you've probably seen all the companies have their beautiful brochures and white papers and just really nice marketing collateral for their products. And oftentimes the field-based genetic counselors are the ones that are behind a lot of that collateral development. And part of that is, translating back to our genetic counseling skills, being able to translate something complicated into something really easy to understand. So that's obviously what marketing is trying to do. They don't want to overcomplicate things. They want to make it seem, easy and and just kind of highlight the product itself. So that's another thing that we'll do. We'll help marketing develop that. KOL, that stands for Key Opinion Leader. That's another acronym I needed to learn when I started at Ambry. And those are medical professionals outside of the company that are willing to speak on your behalf. So a doctor or someone else who really believes in your product and is willing to speak to other providers about that. So we kind of work to identify those people and then get them talking about us. Working trade shows, which we've already talked about. Training and education, we're very well placed to train reps. We have the product knowledge, we have the clinical knowledge, so we often help with that. And then really being a liaison between multiple stakeholders. So again, you can kind of think of the field-based genetic counselors as the customer-facing, the customer-facing person of the company. So if there's a reporting issue, or if there's something wrong in the lab, or if there's something, a tricky case that needs to be communicated, oftentimes those internal departments are going to go to you first to then reach out to the client and vice versa. And just a quick note, I've kind of been using these interchangeably, and there is some difference, and it really depends on what company you're working for, kind of what your formal title will be. So medical science liaison, or MSL, is typically a pharma role, so more often for a pharma company than for like a commercial genetic testing. Has a terminal degree, and these roles really tend to be more restricted from the sales process. So a little bit more strict than kind of what we've been referencing, where you're more of a partner to the sales rep. Their main purpose is KOL development, peer-to-peer interaction. They can train the sales team, and these folks are needed for clinical trials. So sometimes you'll see an MSL role at a genetics company, but more often they're more pharma and a little bit kind of more separate from sales. Clinical science liaisons are typically nurses, patient advocates, and educators for patients joining clinical trials, and so they really are communicating between patients and providers. And then really the role that we're talking most often about kind of throughout this whole presentation is this genetic or genomic specialist or liaison. And this is, again, a clinical laboratory role, mostly genetic counselors, but we certainly have other, folks with other advanced degrees, nurses or other lab personnel. And again, we're really the clinical and technical support for customers and very integrated with the sales team. So with that, I'll move on to really the application and a little bit more into what the day-to-day looks like and how to work with sales reps and kind of looking at some of the skills that we just talked about and what it looks like in real life. So I wanted to start by saying that you're still a genetic counselor first. So I think historically there may have been a little bit more of a negative stigma of going to work for industry, and thankfully that's dissipated quite a bit over the past couple of years as industry roles have really boomed. I think the most recent PSS showed that I think 25% of us are in industry roles. So it's certainly becoming a much bigger population of genetic counselors as a whole. And I think people are really seeing the value of these positions, and really how genetic counselors can really shine in these positions. And the other thing, just day to day, is that you still have to be up to date on the latest research. You still have to know your products inside and out. You have to know all the genes, and I would argue even more so than if you're in clinic, because you're the ones that are supposed to be kind of spreading and disseminating this information to clinicians. So you really have to know what's on the cutting edge. You have to know what you're selling. You have to definitely be up to date on testing and management guidelines so you can really be, again, a resource for your clients. And so, you're still having to push yourself and make sure you're up to date with all those things. And then the other important aspect. Oh, Sarah, sorry, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say, and I think the other point about this is that clients really only call you when they have a case that they can't solve, or it's something that's a difficult, diagnosis or something like that. So really, you need to know all of the kind of the crazy cases too. So you really do have to be up on the latest research, know more than your clients do, because a client's not going to call you with an easy case. They're only going to call you with their most difficult cases.
Absolutely. Great point. And the other thing I'll mention here is that you represent genetic counselors as a whole, but also your company. And, I'll just touch briefly on a topic that we could probably spend an entire hour on in and of itself. But this concept of kind of perceived conflict of interest. So I'm sure if you've been to trade shows and been to conferences, you've seen at the beginning of every single presentation, people have to disclose their conflicts of interest, really whether or not it's related to the presentation at all. And I think, again, fortunately, this seems to be dissipating a little bit, but it is a kind of a fine line to walk between representing yourself as a genetic counselor, but also representing your company and, kind of how you present yourself to the outside world, to other genetic counselors, to your clients as well. So I think I'll just say that there is likely to be this perceived conflict of interest, but at the same time, you are a genetic counselor, just like any of your other colleagues, and again, that oftentimes comes first in kind of what you're talking about, how you're presenting yourself, but it is and can be a fine line because you do also work for a company, and hopefully you believe strongly in the products that you're selling and representing, and so that is going to come through as well. So just wanted to kind of briefly mention that, and again, that could really be a topic in and of itself, but it is certainly something to consider as you're getting into a role like this. So a little more nitty gritty, just kind of in the day-to-day working with a sales reps and dividing responsibility. So really the genetic counselor in a position like this should be the one focused on developing and maintaining the relationships as it relates to the clinical and technical aspect of the product. So, new publications or panels, ongoing clinical or technical questions. Obviously, a lot of what we do may involve non-genetic counseling clinicians who are interested in doing testing for their patients, so there can be a lot of education involved. Again, you're a genetic counselor first. You want to make sure that testing is being done appropriately and in a really smart way. So that's where your role can be really important in terms of educating those providers on who's the best person to test, how to interpret those results, etc. We've already talked a lot about research collaborations, clinical consulting. So again, kind of going back to what's the best test for this patient, what should I do with these results, and then the KOL development. Whereas the sales rep is, their main goal is bringing samples in the door, whether that's acquiring new business. So they'll do a lot of cold calling, which is just stopping into offices and seeing how far they get. They also help maintain current business, but they handle more logistical and billing issues or questions, kit and brochure orders. So really kind of the day-to-day maintenance of a client. And we really rely on them to determine when we're going to be useful. So again, most genetic specialists work with multiple reps. And so we, are familiar with most of the clients in our territory, but the rep may have a more up-to-date knowledge of what's going on with that client and when we could be really useful. And then they should be really helpful in terms of organizing the events that we're speaking at. So whether it's a dinner, a grand rounds, anything like that, they should really be the one taking point on the organization of that. Communication is key. And so this is, something that everyone really has to work through when really in any position, I think, if you're working with a partner, but especially in a position like this, where you're sharing clients, where, you're both working on the same thing, you really have to speak to each other often, whether it's call, text, or email, whatever works. So that could be different for each team. Some individual teams like to have, formal weekly calls. Others just kind of like to text as needed. Most of the time, if you're emailing with a client, you CC your counterpart on that email, even if it doesn't really pertain to them. So there's a lot of ways to stay in touch. Also, as Sarah had mentioned on the first slide, we do a lot of documenting in the CRM. So if we have an interaction with a client, we document that. Again, that translates back to the clinical genetic counseling position, where anytime you talk to a patient, you have to document that in your EMR. So just think of it the same way. It can be really helpful to share calendars, especially for appointment scheduling, so that you're not double booked. You should share goals for the territory, work on client development and KOL development together. So, so if you're thinking that you can really grow business at a certain client, strategize together on how you can make that happen, what the genetic specialist can do, what the rep can do, and how you're going to execute that. There should be some kind of formal monthly meeting. I'd say most companies are probably providing some kind of sales report or numbers or, product count or something. It's going to be different wherever you are, but you're getting some data that you can look at and analyze together and say, oh, this client, dropped off by 20 samples. I wonder what's going on. We need to prioritize getting in there and meeting with them. Or, hey, we haven't met with this genetic counseling group in 6 months. We should really get in there and update them on some of our new panels, et cetera. So kind of making that plan together for the territory is going to be really important. And then before you go into a visit, really pre-call planning. So again, just like you would prepare to go and see a patient, you want to prepare before you go into a client meeting, so you're not just going in cold. Again, you're typically going to be handling the clinical component, but you want to be prepared with what's going to be most relevant to that client, whether it's talking about an publication that's coming out or updates to a panel or an interesting case they had recently, whereas the rep should really be up to speed on making sure the client is aware of the most recent marketing collateral, make sure their ordering process is going smoothly, et cetera, and kind of come up with a plan for how to tackle that appointment. And in terms of delivering results, so this kind of ties back to really closing an account or, kind of helping to grow the business. One thing that I always tell my team is you always want to bring value to a client meeting. So everyone is super busy. You don't want to just stop in and not be bringing something of value to that clinician. So whether it's, again, a product update, if it's new research, if it's, whatever it is, you want to make sure that you're making good use of their time and that you're, proving yourself as a resource to them. And the reps should really work with you to determine the utility of bringing you in to close new business. So do they need a formal presentation to close the deal? Does the doctor really want a little bit more education before they start ordering genetic testing, and you can really help them, walk them through the process? Oftentimes, we'll reach out if it's a new client and they get their first report, we'll reach out proactively and say, what did you think of the report? Do you have any questions? How did it go? How was the process, to kind of have that touch point with them? And then if there's a follow-up visit, are you going to join there again to kind of keep in touch with that clinician? So it's definitely, as Sarah mentioned, a sales process. I'd say rarely is it one meeting and you're done, you have a client for life. You really have to stay in touch with them and work together with your rep to maintain that relationship. And then just briefly, again, this is going to look different at every company, but just to quickly talk about climbing the ladder, because this is probably going to look very different than a clinical position. But most often when you're starting out in a genetic specialist or field-based genetic counseling role, it'll be an entry-level role. So whether it's level 1 or whatever they call it, and that's really just going to be focusing on the day-to-day client interaction. Most companies have a senior genetic specialist role, and that is taking on some more responsibilities like training, maybe mentoring some of the newer entry-level folks, taking on special projects like some of the ones that we've talked about before, getting more involved with research or KOL development. So just kind of growing your portfolio of what you're doing at the company. And then once you move up to manager, that's when you actually have your own team. So it varies. Sometimes managers will have their own territory as well, plus they'll be managing, and sometimes they will just be managing. So I did a little bit of both. When I started as a manager, I also still had some of my own territory plus a team that I managed as well. So that was a little bit crazy trying to balance both, because as a manager, you are not only in pretty frequent communication with your team, but you're also co-traveling with them to work on their development, work on their skills, and also to provide additional support for really key client meetings. So kind of being a more senior face of the company, and being that person for them in those meetings. And then the director role, I would say, rarely has their own territory. I don't at this point as a director. And now I'm managing multiple teams, and so now the managers report up into me, and so I rely on them to kind of keep me in the loop about what's happening in the territories, and I'm focused a little bit more bigger picture, a little bit more strategy, overall strategy for the company, working with the other members of commercial leadership, and, to kind of drive the goals of the company as a whole. So again, that'll look a little bit different company to company, but that's kind of the ladder that you can potentially expect.
And I think too, in that same vein, and great job, Emily, as far as the ladder goes, it's not just a ladder, it's, you can go into other divisions within a company. I started out in sales and now I'm in product management, which falls more under marketing. If you want to learn more about those different types of jobs, please check out the other webinars in this series, like Business 101 and Marketing 101 for the genetic counselor, which will be coming out as well.
Great point. Yes, thanks, Sarah. So I'll turn it back over to you now to kind of close us out.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things I'm very passionate about in this same vein for sales is translation and the things that overlap with your clinical training. When I first started in a sales role and I went straight from graduate school into industry, I was really skeptical about the sales process. And the more that I learned and the more that I listened to my sales colleagues and the more books I read, the more I started to feel like sales really overlaps a lot with what we do in clinic as a genetic counselor. And that the sales process is very, very similar to the informed consent process or the genetic counseling process. And like I said before, the skills that we use, we can also use in here. And so some of the major skills that, we use and think of every day in genetic counseling, listening. I think especially in the roles that I've had in sales, I've become a much better listener, making sure that you're providing information that's valuable to the person in front of you, not what you think is important. And I think that's a big tenet of genetic counseling in general. Empathy, having empathy for the client in front of you. I mean, that's one of the basic tenets. Making sure you're assessing the comfort level of the person in front of you. Are they comfortable ordering genetic counts or genetic testing? Do they not feel comfortable? That would change how your conversation goes. And always making yourself available and a valuable resource. So, like Emily said, always bring value to an appointment. I would say that's my number one thing, is always bring something that's valuable. And so one of the things that I wanted to really go over to kind of hone in on the point is that when you look at the competencies, the core competencies that we need for genetic counseling, so if you look at domain 1, demonstrate and utilize a depth and breadth of understanding and knowledge of genetics and genomics core concepts and principles. Like Emily said, you're a genetic counselor first, and always know more than your client. I think when I first started, I mean, it was a pretty steep learning curve because, like I said, people always do call you with their most difficult cases, and so you really need to be on your game. But that is probably one of the number one things that we do in these medical science liaison or genomic specialist type of roles. And then you'll also see critically assess genetic, medical, and social science literature and information. Always being up to date on the literature is one of the biggest things that we have to do in these kinds of jobs. And I marked out 2 of the things here. So in these roles, because we don't see patients, typically, we don't need to take a family history or a pedigree. I still need to know how to look at a family history and a pedigree, and I still need to understand it, but I don't personally draw them. And then the other thing is, the other one that I marked out also has to do with pedigree and probability and looking at test results and doing that on an individual patient. So we don't do some of these things because we don't see patients, but we still need to understand them and we still need to be able to use those skills. So when we look at domain 2, so really talking about the psychosocial and counseling skills, establishing a mutually agreed upon genetic counseling agenda with the client. This is something that you do every time that you meet with your client or the clinician in front of you, just like you do with a patient in clinic. If you have an agenda in mind and that physician or genetic counselor in front of you doesn't agree with that agenda, that meeting's not going anywhere. So having that agreed upon agenda is really important no matter which side of the table you're on, whether or not you're working in a sales-based position or whether or not you're the genetic counselor seeing a patient. The other thing that I think probably is a misconception about genetic counselors that work in sales, really at the end of the day, again, we are genetic counselors first. So we do want to promote informed and value-based decision-making. We know that we can't force anyone to order a test, and we don't want to force anybody to order a test. We stick by the values that we have as genetic counselors to help you make a decision that's best for you and your patient. And education. So education is one, and I think when Emily and I were talking about these and looking over these, education is one of the biggest things that we do in a sales-based role. Like Emily said, being that clinical and technical support person and establishing yourself as that is really important. And you do a lot of talks. You speak to a lot of physicians and genetic counselors and educating them or working with them. And I think number 15 is also really important, that points out to the genetic counselor's ability to translate technical information into varying audiences and reading levels, which makes this also really good at creating marketing materials. So a lot of these skills are things that we'll use every day in a wide range of industry roles. And then for domain 4, so understanding the research process. Emily's been involved in more publications than I have, but I certainly have had a couple publications and a few posters. And so understanding the research process and thinking critically about it, because the people that you're talking to also think critically about it and understand the research process. And so you want to be able to have an intelligent conversation as well as getting the data out there. When you're working with key opinion leaders or KOLs, a lot of times you're working with them to create a research study or helping them with a grant or something like that. And many times you need to understand that research process in order to move that forward. And then number 22, establish and maintain professional relationships in both a team and one-on-one setting. I think, no matter if you're in a healthcare system or if you're like me and you work at a company with 40,000 plus employees, you have to know where your role is, how you fit in, what's your function, and work with the people around you in a team setting. In other places, you might be the only genetic counselor at that healthcare system, or you might be the only genetic counselor working at that company. So knowing where you fit in and working well with others, of course, is always really important. And I wanted to go over this particular diagram because I pulled this out of the integrity selling for the 21st century, how to sell the way people want to buy. And I wanted to go over this because I pulled this straight from the book. And basically what you're looking at is the model, the sales model, whereas integrity selling is the methodology. So you approach the client, you first meet them. So whenever you were first meeting with a patient, then you go to the interview phase where you want the customer or the patient to talk a lot. So you're asking them questions, and really this is whenever you're first setting that mutually agreed upon agenda. You're talking with the patient, trying to see why they believe that they're coming in, those types of things. In the sales role, you would be talking to the client about whether or not they order genetic testing. Do they see the value in it? And then you move on to the demonstrate phase. So if you thought about whenever you're demonstrating to your patient, what do chromosomes look like? These are the testing options that you have available, versus in a genomic science liaison type of role, your demonstrate would be, here's the different types of testing that we offer. These are the panels. This is why we chose to do it this way. And then for validate, you hear the client's concerns about whatever products you've shown them, or you hear the patient's concerns about the testing options that you've given to them, and you talk them through each of the different scenarios and help validate their concerns and work them through that. And then negotiate, working with them to come to a conclusion as to whether or not they want to order your product, or you negotiate with the patient to say, here are your different testing options. How do you feel about each of these? Do you feel like this is the right thing for you? And then in closing, the close would be, yes, I agree. I think I am ready to order your product. Or a closing could be for the patient making that informed decision-making process and saying, yes, I want to have testing, or no, I don't because of these reasons. So when you look at these sales models, I think you can hopefully see how these skills and what we do in a counseling session with the patient really can translate over into what you would do in a sales-based position, but instead of a patient in front of you, you have a clinician in front of you. And then we wanted to really give you something that you could kind of have your take home, right, Emily?
Yes. Yeah. So just kind of a quick checklist to go through if you're considering an industry position.
I think, being comfortable traveling and being away from home. I personally, I love being at the airport. I find it totally fun. If you're somebody that doesn't love flying every week, possibly not the best fit for you.
Yeah, and I think like we had mentioned, having a flexible work schedule and being okay with some nights and weekends. It's not typically a traditional 9 to 5, so that's a big one as well for sure.
I think one of the things too, working from home, I personally am a talker. I love chatting with people. I struggle a little bit with working from home because I want to have those conversations. So I think making sure you're okay with not having the office social life is a big one to think about as well.
Yeah, and another big one for me, and this is something that I always make sure to highlight or ask about when interviewing folks, is now I'm on more on the hiring side of things and hiring up new genetic specialists. And so I always ask specifically about, selling testing and providing education to non-genetic counselors. So obviously, in an ideal world, every single patient getting genetic testing would see a genetic counselor, but we don't live in an ideal world. We live in the real world, and we know that that's not possible. And so some folks feel more strongly about that than others, but that is definitely an aspect of these jobs. We are representing the company. We want to, drive the company's objectives and bring samples in the door, but do it in a responsible way. So that definitely involves selling to and kind of educating non-genetic counselors on how to do genetic testing. So that's a big one for me too.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think it ties in nicely to how you feel about sales in general. Do you have a positive or negative connotation about sales? If you only think of sales as a certain kind of person, and that's not a very negative, it's not a very positive reaction, then definitely it takes some time to sit down and think about that. And then the other things that we wanted to have you consider before you choose an industry position. So looking at what type of company is it? So private versus public. There's some big differences. Generally, I would say, and Emily can chime in, I think generally private companies are usually smaller versus public companies are usually a lot bigger, and where you fit within that company can be very different.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, we're probably all familiar with kind of the big genetic testing players, but there's a lot more companies that are hiring up genetic counselors these days, more pharma companies, more kind of outside the typical scope, the Ambries, Myriads, Quest that we all know. And so kind of learning about the company itself and, like Sarah said, where you fit is going to be really, really important. And with that, the culture, I think, is big too. So, just how many GCs do they employ? Kind of where does your department fit in the overall scheme of things? What's the company like? Is it very kind of strict and, very black and white in terms of what their rules are? Is it a little bit more loose in terms of, kind of how they function as a company, and how does that fit with your personality?
Right. And then I think, what does success look like in your role? I think an MSL role is really quite different than maybe an actual sales rep role, where an MSL role, like you're not judged based on how many tests are coming through the door. And the same is true for, the clinical science liaison or the genomic specialist. You're not judged based on numbers, but what are you judged on? What does success look like within the company? What are your expectations? For how you will succeed in that role. And
Yeah.
another big one for me is, opportunities for growth, having that ability to move throughout the company or gain new skills.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think I have a ton else to add here, but yeah, just to kind of think about all these things in addition to your specific role, just how you fit within the company too.
Right. And then some of the other things we wanted to leave you with are some resources. Of course, you can always contact Emily or myself, as being the authors of this talk, or anyone in the Industry SIG Outreach Subcommittee. And there's our emails there. We also wanted to leave you with some resources. So a guide to genetic counseling has a small section on evolving roles and expanding opportunities. The new book, Defining the Role of the Laboratory Genetic Counselor, and then some of the sales books that at least I have found valuable. I know Emily has the question-based selling book. I haven't read Spin Selling. Have you read that one, Emily?
I haven't read that one, no, but I, definitely have the question-based selling one too. So, yeah. Yeah, some great resources. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions. And like I said, we really wanted to put this together because we know these roles are becoming more widespread. So we wanted to give you guys some tools to really critically think about whether this is a good option for you. So with that, we'll go ahead and stop the recording.